Yes, good morning everyone. I am recording this class today, Sunday, because on Tuesday evening I will be flying, so I cannot make it. This is probably one of the most fascinating and interesting aspects of the theory of international economics that is pretty demanding because it requires that you know everything: microeconomics, macroeconomics, international economics. So it's one of the most advanced topics in economics that I can think of. And the value is that it explains very much what happens today in Europe, what happened in the financial crisis, international financial crisis of Mexico, Brazil, East Asia, Russia, Argentina. And it has a lot to do with the crisis that we had 2 years ago, in 2008, because the core of the discussion is that what happens when you have a fixed exchange rate or relatively fixed exchange rate. We kind of have a relatively fixed exchange rate in the world because the relationship with the conversion rate between the euro and the dollar and the yen was relatively stable. It was not exactly a fixed system, but was relatively stable. And we have a tremendous volatility because of the global funds. Remember that we discussed in previous weeks that the global GDP today is $50 trillion, and the global funds are $500 trillion, considering funds and swaps, and we are not considering other derivatives because otherwise the situation is even worse. But the fluctuations that all this gigantic amount of money produces in the real economy can be really catastrophic, and it was catastrophic in 2008 in the real estate market in the US, and it's being catastrophic in Europe today. That you can see Europe as a set of countries that have a fixed exchange rate among all of them. I mean, this is what the euro is at the end of the day. So if Greece has a drachma and Italy has a lira and Spain has a peseta and so on, so basically what the euro does is that say, okay, it is as if the lira and the drachma and the peseta and the franc and everything else, they have the same conversion rate from now on. So what happens when some global funds enter into the country, and after some years, for different reasons that we are going to study now, they decide to abandon the country. So it's a really fascinating piece of theory, and I strongly believe that for you that are studying this PhD in economics will be also really fascinating. So let's get into the topic. The first discussion here is about the creation of a model, a conceptual model that relates all these variables, especially the monetary and fiscal policy. This is probably the most interesting aspect because this is when you start connecting politics and economics. And this is what this paper that I wrote, The Crisis of Argentina, tries to show, that politics is a tremendous part of this crisis. Because you can think of countries that didn't have this issue. For example, Ecuador, that have a dollarization that is also a fixed exchange rate, if you want, and they didn't have any problem, but they could manage the political aspect. But countries like Spain or Greece especially, they had a political situation that was complex. And but the key issue here, and this is very important for you to realize, that is when a country is having a weak or not very serious monetary and fiscal policy, not consistent with the fixed exchange rate, as the case of Argentina or many other countries, but also this conjunction of the effects of international global funds, that they may decide to speculate in a single country. So this conjunction is what makes everything so complex. You have to realize about these aspects. We tend to believe that the crisis of the euro is what's going on, blah blah, and we have to consider that there is a convergence of factors, monetary and fiscal policy that we are going to see today, plus the existence of this gigantic amount of global funds. So the first thing, we are going to derive this DD curve. Basically, DD curve, it is named like that because of the aggregate demand. So we want to see what happens in the aggregate demand. You know this very well. I'm not going to explain this equation. Yes, you are economists. Okay, what is interesting is this curve, because this is kind of the prerequisite to understand the DD curve. And what you have here is in horizontal axis the real income, and in the vertical axis the demand. And basically you may wonder why this line has a slope that is not a 1, is not 45 degrees. And the answer is what I wrote here. The demand has lower slope than 1 because of imports. It means you can increase the real income, but parts of the money doesn't go to aggregate demand. It goes to imports. So it reduces aggregate demand. That's why the slope is lower than 45 degrees. Okay, so let's consider this line, and let's consider the other line, that is this red 45 degrees aggregate demand, identical to aggregate income or aggregate output, if you want. So what happens when you are out of equilibrium? For example, you are in the point 2. In the point 2, you see that there is more demand than output. More demand than output. That's why the producers will produce more and will move to the point 1. And the same happens in point 3, that there is more output than demand. Then the producer will have to produce less and go back to the point 1. So the point 1 is the point of equilibrium, where you have the aggregate demand and the output. So this is the point in which the economy operates in equilibrium. So what happens when you produce a devaluation? Remember that devaluation means that the exchange rate gets higher. So if you, instead of having a, well, I don't need to explain it because I think you already know, but let's assume that the conversion rate between the dollar and the euro is 1.5 and it goes to 1.7. It means that you need more dollars to buy 1 euro. It means that you are devaluing. Okay, what happens when you have a devaluation? When you have a devaluation, automatically the foreign products get more expensive and the domestic products get more inexpensive, and consequently imports go down and exports go up. So consequently, this produces an increase in the output. You see in the horizontal axis, it goes from Y1 to Y2. It's an increase in the output. So consequently, you see here that you go from point 1 to point 2, and because of the devaluation, and this produces an increase in the output. The economy expands. So consequently, you can correlate the relationship between exchange rate. Let me write it here, so you can follow what I'm saying. Let's do it in green. So you see here that the correlationship between the exchange rate and the output is this DD curve. This is a new thing. And you create this DD curve by way of realizing that we moved from point 1 to point 2 in the previous slide that I showed you, based on a certain amount of the devaluation. So we put here the two exchange rates, prior to the devaluation and after the devaluation. And you have here the two new levels of output and aggregate demand. And based on those, you can write here the aggregate demand and draw the DD curve. So welcome to the DD curve. And the interesting part of the DD curve, I will show you later, is that it represents the fiscal policy. So it has a relationship with the fiscal policy. There are other ingredients also. But so you were able to connect the exchange rate, the fiscal policy, if you want, and the output of the economy. Okay, let's go to I'm sorry, what happens, this is explanation of what I just told you. What happens if there, in this aggregate demand, that the first line that I show you, you increase the government spending. If you increase the government spending, you produce an expansion of the output. So consequently, you can see here in the line that you can move the DD line from DD1 to DD2 by producing an expansion in the fiscal policy. Sorry, I should have told you that before. Okay, so now we can go to the other curve, the second curve in this model, that is the AA curve. The AA curve is the assets, especially the foreign exchange assets and the money market. So you have to stop there. We will not consider other assets in the model. This is what we mean by assets, the assets market here. And basically we are going to derive this AA curve, and you will see that it's relatively straightforward. Remember that we saw this graph last week that shows how the money market, that's why the AA is connected with the foreign exchange market. And remember that if we have a certain amount of money supply, and for some reason the economy expands from the point 1 to the point 2, there is an increase in output, so you start seeing, bingo, okay, this is part of my chart, the output, that is the horizontal line in the previous chart. Okay, what happens is that when you have that expansion, you naturally produce a need for more money that raises the interest rates. So the local market has an increase in the interest rates, money interest rates, domestic interest rates, because there is an expansion of the economy, so consequently you need more money. And this increase in the interest rates, if you keep exactly the same foreign exchange rates, what it produces is a revaluation of the local money, of the dollar in this case. A revaluation because if the interest rates in the United States go up, automatically this will produce more demand for dollars, and consequently the dollar will appreciate. Remember that the appreciation of the dollar means that you need less dollars per euro. Consequently, it goes from E1 to E2. So the conversion rate, the exchange rate goes down. This is a revaluation. Okay, so now you have the connection. So you have the connection between the exchange rate and the output, you see. So you can build the AA curve. The AA is especially for assets. So you want to connect the assets. And so you see that, as we saw in the previous slide, revaluation of the dollar produces an expansion of the output, if you want. So from the financial market, from the financial assets market, you see this is interesting because it's exactly the opposite effect as the fiscal that we saw in the DD scale. So if you put them together, you can see that the DD schedule, the DD line, has this shape. That is practically a correlation between a devaluation and the output, but from the financial point of view, from the financial asset point of view, the effect is exactly the opposite. So you have here the DD represents the fiscal policy, as I show you, and the AA represents the monetary policy. Remember, this comes from this chart here, that it is the monetary policy that you are operating in this case, because you are talking about the assets from the central bank. As you know, in these videos that I'm developing for you, I'm not giving you all the theory. I'm focusing on only the financial market. But if you read the book, you will see how all the chapters speaks about the monetary assets, etc., which I'm saving for sake of time. So the interesting thing here is that this puts together the political situation with the financial situation, as I told you in the beginning. So you can see what happens when the government intervenes in a country. And now you have to think in countries like Argentina, like the paper that I wrote, and you have to take a look, is that it's the political aspect that has a strong impact in all this foreign exchange market and financial market, etc., etc. And the same happens in countries like Greece, that they, as you know, they expanded the fiscal and monetary policies while they were into the euro, that is a fixed exchange rate system, and they should have done so because it puts the entire system in jeopardy. So this is interesting that you start seeing the big pieces of this puzzle, and the political part is a tremendous part of it. However, what is interesting is that this model shows that when the politics of the government work in some direction, they have an impact on the real economy. This is the fascinating part of this model. So in other words, you see here is what happens when you have an increase in money supply. This is an A thing, is a monetary policy. So when you go to this monetary policy at this level of monetary assets, and you expand it, so the government incorporates more money into the system. You know very well how the central bank or the Federal Reserve can do it, inject more money in the system through the banks, reducing the discount rate or more government operations, whatever. So you have an expansion in the AA curve. It goes from AA1 to AA2, and the effect is it produces a devaluation, so a devaluation of the currency. But this devaluation of the currency helps you to see that they lead to an increase in the output. This is easy to understand because we know very well that when we move into the DD curve to a higher level of aggregate demand by way of less imports and more exports. So you have less imports and more exports. It's easy to realize that you move to the right of the line. Okay, so what happens in the opposite, in the other way? So when you operate on the aggregate demand curve, so you produce an expansion of the aggregate demand simply by increasing the government spending, having more public officials, if you want. So okay, this produces the opposite effect. So it leads to a revaluation. So there is more money in the market, and consequently, with more money, you produce a revaluation that also has a positive impact in output. But you see that you have the two opposite trends. Okay, so let's keep it. Let's keep this concept, and now we jump into the next chapter. But you see that you can operate into the demand, into this fiscal policy and monetary policy, and you can produce increases in the output, and eventually you can, if you manipulate these variables in a wise way, you can control inflation. But if you don't, you can produce inflation, and this is the interesting thing about it. So let's go into the next chapter, that is the explanation of what happens in the euro. This foreign exchange intervention, the mega devaluations, capital flights, financial speculation, etc. So this is fascinating because it's the core of the current financial crisis and the fragility of the financial system, current financial system. So it's something that is extremely interesting to stop it, and if you don't understand, go to the book, read it in detail. I'm just making a very, very broad explanation. Okay, so what happens is that in Europe they have practically a fixed exchange rate, and in some countries like we had in during the 90s, there was practically a managed floating exchange rate that in fact was almost fixed. So, and let's see what happens when you have a fixed exchange system. So basically what you're saying is that this exchange rate is going to be fixed, so you're not going to change it. So you have moments of happiness in which global funds enter into your economy, like Greece or Spain or Argentina or Brazil or Mexico or Southeast Asia, like Taiwan or Singapore, all the countries that suffer these financial collapses. And you see that you have an expansion of the money supply because you have thousands of billions of dollars or whatever entering into your economy. So what happens is that it produces a natural, if you want, bonanza, if you want, because you can, with this increase in the exchange, in the money supply, you have an exchange and an increase in the output of the economy. So the output goes up. But together with that, you have some pressure, because see what happens. So you move from these levels. Let me erase it. You go from this M1 that leads to this exchange rate to this M2 that in this case leads to the same exchange rate. It seems that nothing happens. You see that it seems that everything is fine. But when you come to this model, the AA and DD, and you have a monetary expansion because you receive all those global funds, and you have a fiscal expansion, that is that the government uses those funds and pays for more government officials or produces more highways or whatever. So there is an expansion of the government spending. And you can see that you can still keep a fixed exchange rate. So initially, let's say that you have an increase of government expenditure, fixed expense from DD1 to DD2. Okay, this leads to a revaluation of the exchange rate, but then you produce a monetary expansion from AA1 to AA2, and this produces a devaluation. So altogether, you have a revaluation and devaluation, but at the end of the day, you can keep exactly the same level of exchange rate. So this is almost like a miracle, you see. So with all this money, you have a big party, because the government can expand the fiscal policy apparently at no cost. But it's not true. There is a cost, and the cost is inflation. And the inflation is catastrophic, because what it produces, it leads to, let me see where it is written. It leads to, I'm trying to find the page where all of this is explained. Okay, yeah. So it leads to a situation in which interest rates go up. Just to remind you where this is. This is here. You see interest rates go up. Goes from this point to this point, you see. And with this expansion of interest rates, you have a lot of evil situations, if you want. Is that, okay, I forgot to tell you something. I apologize. I have to tell you, when you have the inflation, let's go in pieces here so we don't get confused. So initially you have the expansion, monetary expansion, from M1 to M2 in that graph. This monetary expansion leads to an increase in the Y, in the output, in the income. And so this is kind of the nice thing. However, this chart tells you, be careful, because you will also have inflation. So, okay, the exchange rate is fine. You will not have any problem with the exchange rate market, but you will have inflation. And you know what happens when you have inflation, local inflation. That is, the local products become more expensive, the foreign products keep the same value, consequently become relatively cheaper. So people start buying a Swiss cheese instead of buying a domestic cheese, and buy a German car instead of buying a domestic car, etc., etc. And then you have unemployment, and then you have a recession, and then you have a politically unsustainable situation. So you cannot live with unemployment, you cannot live with inflation, and you cannot live with a low aggregate demand, low output, so with recession. So consequently, the entire market knows that sooner or later you will have to devalue. And so this situation is, you cannot sustain this situation. The only way is if you have some external accidents, like the chart shows, is that the foreign exchange rates go down, whatever. But as long as that it doesn't happen, you will have a contraction of the monetary base, gigantic contraction, mega contraction, because you will have a capital flight. So the foreign capitals will leave the country, producing a contraction of the financial market and an expansion of the interest rates, and this situation is unsustainable. So consequently, you will have to devalue. So necessarily, you will have to. You are having a revaluation. You will have to devalue. You have to just abandon the fixed exchange system altogether. This is the big map, no? You have to play with it. You have to start asking things to the model, what happens when you move one curve and the other curve. But basically, the whole thing relies on the capital landing into a country and abandoning the country, and what are all the distortions that it produces, knowing from this previous chart that the whole thing is that you can keep the fixed exchange rate like the euro, or the fixed exchange rate of Argentina, or the East Asian country, or Brazil, or whatever. But it produces all the increase in fiscal expansion produces inflation. and the monetary expansion produces inflation. Everything produces inflation. So the monetary and fiscal policy both are inflationary. Expansion of fiscal policy produces inflation. Expansion of monetary policy produces inflation. So consequently, it's explosive. So it's a tremendous pressure on inflation, domestic inflation. This domestic inflation leads to more expensive local products versus foreign products. It means to explosion of imports and fall of exports. So this leads to recession, local recession. This leads to unemployment. Remember, Spain has an unemployment of 25%. Greece has a similar level. So Argentina had the same level, had an unemployment of 27%, something like that. And so the situation becomes completely explosive, socially explosive, politically explosive. So the only solution is abandon the fixed exchange rate. All the rest of the chapter speaks about the different fixed and floating exchange rate, like Bretton Woods or the gold or whatever, that they have different models, and it shows what are the pros and cons of each one. Okay, this is it. I hope you enjoyed this chapter, but I personally find that it's absolutely fascinating, and it's probably the last part of the last piece of mathematics that you did in this class. All the rest of the weeks will be more conceptual, less mathematical. But it's fascinating how all these variables get connected, and you can connect to fiscal policy, monetary policy. It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, and hope you enjoy this discussion.